Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you all to the first environmental identity session that we are going to have, which is part of a series, Environmental Identities. This is also part of a larger scope, the Jan van Eyck dealing with the effects of climate change and how climate change affects art practice and the organization. This is a program that is being set up by Bruno. And he will take over from me explaining more in depth what the project is about. I'd like to welcome Dr. Susan Clayton, environmental psychologist at the Worcester College. And I'm going to give it to you, Bruno, to do the rest. Thank you.
Hi, everyone here and everyone online. Thank you, Hisham, for the introduction. As you said, today is the initial event of the Environmental Identity series, which is basically a series of conversations and online screenings and online and offline programs that will unfold over the upcoming months, and we'll look at the correlation between self and social identity and natural environment. And we thought it would be relevant to talk about this correlation and to look at in a multifaceted way through art, but also through the social and natural sciences. On the one hand, because I think we're all living in, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we're all living in circumstances in our lives that I speak for myself. I've never passed through such a weird time in my life. And I think never before has the connection to our natural environment or to the effects that climate change or global warming has was so tangible for me. And it has been surprising to see how, with only one of the many effects that will unfortunately happen in the future, our habits and our behaviors have changed so much, not only at an individual scale with our daily lives, but at a global scale. So globally, we're all mobilized, and our movements and modes of governance have suffered drastic changes. And I'm sure that it will have impacts of our understanding of self and social communities and identities throughout the world, and also the effects will probably escalate in the coming times. So it felt important to address this topic within the context of the Van Eyck, also because the Van Eyck has this new mission and this new ambition that is related to both in time scale and in ambition to tackle climate change in relation to the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees that was published by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So the institution will mobilize itself on the next 10 years in order to understand how an arts institution and what's the significance and civic agency of arts and creative practices in tackling this so wide and so vast problem. And on the other hand, the institution is also suffering and going through a shift in identity. So there will be a new visual identity for the institution that is not only a visual rebrand, but also is a way to communicate this new institutional mission and commitment over the course of the next 10 years following the trajectory that has been set up by the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. So these two different scales, both at the global level and what we're living right now, and a smaller scale at the institutional level of the ambition of the institution, plus the identity shift, were reasons enough for us to want to lean upon this correlation and look at it in a multifaceted way through the arts. But I'm sure there are many, many others, and I'm very keen on talking with Dr. Susan Clayton today because she has been studying the concept or the idea of environmental identity. And for me, this is the best way to start the series of conversations titled Environmental Identities. Before I introduce Dr. Susan, I wanted to give you just the practicalities of having an online-offline situation and a program. So for those watching online, you can address us, Dr. Susan Clayton and myself and the audience through the Zoom chat, Q&A, I'm sorry. So you can ask your questions or make your comments through the Q&A. And for those watching on YouTube, you can do the same thing just by going on to the YouTube chat. And my colleague Yasmine Ossendorf will have, we'll make a selection of questions to be addressed in the end. For those who are here, you can just raise your hands when the conversation is over, and then because of the COVID-19 regulations that are in place, you'll have to go to that microphone in the middle of the room and ask your question there, and then go back to your seat again. So it shouldn't be very complicated. So Dr. Susan, it's a pleasure to have you here. I'll read out your bio. Dr. Susan Clayton is Whitmore Williams Professor of Psychology and Chair of Psychology at the College of Worcester in Ohio, USA. She has written or edited 6 books, including most recently Psychology and Climate Change in 2018, co-edited with Christy Manning. She co-authored the American Psychological Association report on psychology and global climate change and psychological impacts of climate change. She is the lead author of the upcoming 6th assessment report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Her PhD from Yale University is in social psychology. Her research focuses on the human relationship with nature, how it's socially constructed, and how it can be utilized to promote environmental concern. Dr. Susan is on the editorial boards of the Journal of Environmental Psychology and Social Justice Research, and is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, the Society for Environmental, Population, and Conservation Psychology, and the Society for the Psychological Studies of Social Issues. And she's a past president of the 2 latter. Very welcome, Dr. Susan. Thank you for joining us today. It's very exciting for me to be talking to you.
Great. Well, thanks for inviting me to this very interesting event.
So I just described you as a social psychologist, but I know your work also fits in the conservation psychologists, in the conservation psychology. And I feel that many of our viewers might not be aware of what is the study of environmental psychology. So before we dive into the notion of environmental identity, I would like to ask you to give a general outline of these fields and also how your work is located within them.
Sure. Well, I have to acknowledge at the beginning that not everybody uses the terms in the exact same way. So it's been a challenge to try and get some definitional clarity. But in general, environmental psychology is a field that's been around since about the 1950s, essentially studying how people are affected by a physical environment. So that includes the built environment, things like how people are affected by lighting levels and color and crowding, and very much the natural environment. And in more recent years, there's been just an explosion of research on how people are affected by the natural environment. Conservation psychology is more of a value-oriented kind of subfield that is focused on trying to improve environmental conservation by understanding how people relate to the natural environment. So a lot of conservation psychology work might focus on how do you intervene to change behavior to make it more sustainable. But some of the work in conservation psychology is a little less applied and also kind of seeks to understand what are the background factors, the values, the identities, the attitudes that might encourage someone to take care of the natural world.
When I came across this notion of environmental identity, the first thing I felt is the ideas of identity and the environment are already in themselves so hard to pin down and to define in only one way that environmental identity seems to pose an extra complexity there. So I'm gonna be asking you a lot of questions about environmental identity in relation to many subjects and aspects. So we'll be able to go deeper in some respects. But I just wanted to go forward with this conversation by first asking you to give us a general outline of what do we mean when we talk about environmental identity, and how is this term even came to be what it is now?
Yeah, you're right that they're very kind of fuzzy concepts, and fortunately, or unfortunately, a lot of psychology deals with fuzzy concepts. So we're used to it, happiness, prejudice, etc. I'll define it very briefly as kind of a personal sense of connection to the natural world. And I think a useful way to think about it is to think about other sources of identity. So you've I think, already mentioned national identity, or you could think of a professional identity. We have multiple identities, and they affect the way we think about ourselves. So your national identity, for some people, it might matter a lot. For other people, it might matter less, but it does affect you to think of yourself as a citizen of a particular nation. It makes some things matter more. So you're probably going to pay attention to, things that are happening in that country, even if you don't happen to be living there at the time. And other things matter less. But again, we don't just have a single identity, and sometimes it changes over time. So sometimes you might be very aware of your national identity, other times you're not thinking about it at all.
Is environmental identity then a variable that depends on the context of where people live in, or is it something that we can all have regardless of our place of origin or other types of identities that we might have?
So definitely an environmental identity is something that everyone can have, but it varies in strength from one individual to another. Probably a big influence is how you were brought up. So your childhood experiences, because a lot of our identities are very strongly formed in childhood. But it's also the case that as an adult, you might have certain experiences that make you more aware of your environmental identity than at other times. So certainly being out in nature is going to be important both as a child, but even as an adult, in sort of helping to create and activate your environmental identity.
And can you elaborate a little bit more on the relation between environmental identity and place attachment?
Yes, yes, a good question. They're probably related, but they are very much different things. Place attachment and place identity is also studied, is really your connections to a specific geographical location. And for many people, it's their home, their hometown. It may or may not be an attachment to the natural features of the place. It could be to the built environment. Whereas environmental identity is not an attachment to a specific place, but to the idea of nature and the natural environment.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This attachment to nature and the natural environment has been proved consecutively by both the natural sciences and the social sciences that have shown us with research and facts that we are both physically, but also emotionally and cognitively connected to the natural environment. So it spans from the fact that we obey our bodies obey to the circadian rhythms, to now the recent discoveries that our gut microbiome can affect our neural behaviors and emotional phenomena, and go on and so on and so forth. But despite all the evidence, the accumulated evidence that we as humans have that could allow us to understand and to acknowledge and accept that our bodies are actually just a bunch of symbiosis processes, and we are indeed physically connected to the outside and to the environment. Despite all the evidence, I might be wrong, but it doesn't seem like we're hardwired, at least in our Western societies, that we are hardwired to really accept that intrinsically. So, and I'm sure that there are many reasons why that happens. And it would be too much maybe to ask you to address them all. So I'm particularly interested in understanding if there is an opposition, or at least a huge friction between the possibility of having an environmental identity and the way we understand individuality in our Western societies, that it's basically as separate units in competition to one another. And this conception is at the base of our social and political and economic system. So are these two different notions of understanding ourselves or as individuals conflictive, or can we reconcile those two? How do we do it?
I think they're not fundamentally incompatible, but they are sort of forces that pull you in opposite directions. So there is a tension between them. And I think you're absolutely right that in Western cultures, where the emphasis is very strongly on the individual, that's hard to reconcile with an environmental identity, which is essentially a sense that no, we're all connected. And in addition to that sort of individual versus collective emphasis, Western society, I think, also encourages a very hierarchical position. So not only am I an individual, but I might have a sense of myself as an individual somewhere within the social hierarchy, with the most important people on top, and then less important people, and below that the animals, and below that the insects, and so on. Whereas an environmental identity is definitely a much more egalitarian kind of stance. It says, yeah, we're all part of the system. We all depend on each other. And so therefore, you can't say this is the most important part of the system because the system requires all the components.
Yes, I brought a quote from Karen Barrett, the American theorist, and I wanted to just share it with you and get your ideas on it, where she defines entanglements so I quote, "Entanglements are not intertwinings of separate entities, but rather irreducible relations of responsibility." And I was wondering if we cannot even acknowledge, or I'm generalizing here, but it seems like for our Western societies, it's hard to acknowledge these entanglements in the first place. So even less than being as irreducible relations of responsibility. So I wanted to ask you, what is the effect on pro-environmental behavior that we don't understand these entanglements, even less as relations of responsibility towards our non-human and non-living environment?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think recognizing entanglements or connections does entail a recognition of responsibilities. And that's something that's been studied a lot at a cultural level, where you have cultures that are more collectivist. People feel a greater sense of responsibility to their other social connections, for example. So I think in the West, one thing that might discourage us from feeling a strong environmental identity is that we don't want to feel those responsibilities.
Yeah.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. So it might motivate you to say, no, we're not all connected, because you don't want to take on the responsibilities for caring for the environment that recognition would entail. And this might anticipate something you were going to get at later, but I think the coronavirus, COVID-19, it does remind us of interdependence and how we are, subject to, I'll say, perturbation or disturbance in the environment. At some level, that disturbance in the environment was a consequence of our behavior by, human infringement on natural habitats, for example. So it kind of reminds us of that entanglement and simultaneously says, and you need to change your behavior to avoid this kind of thing happening in the future.
So how do we translate the connection that we have, or that we might have, with our natural environments, being an environmental identity, into action? Do you have any specific facts on how that translation can be made effectively?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think your question kind of reminds us that we very often don't behave in ways that are consistent with our values. So we can, value good health and nevertheless, eat food that's bad for us, or drink too much, or not exercise. So we can value the environment and nevertheless do things that damage it. So it is there is that gap between kind of individual values and identity and behavior, and we need to find ways to cross that gap. It depends, is my answer. It depends on what kind of behavior you're trying to create. The most specific thing, if you're trying to encourage a kind of single behavior, is just to make that behavior easier. Another important thing is to harness social norms. So if you think that everybody else around you is doing that behavior, you're more likely to do it. So all of those things have nothing to do with your environmental identity. But it is also the case that reminding people of their identity and of the values that identity promotes might encourage them, and probably does encourage them, to behave in more pro-environmental ways.
Earlier on, you mentioned national identity and group identity. So now I wanted to shift a little bit on the impact that environmental identities might have in the formation of group and collective identities. And so I wanted to understand a bit of that, how that process happens, and also what are the similarities and differences between an environmental group identity and a national or ethnic group identity, for instance.
Well, that question can be answered in several ways, and I'll say something that sounds a little bit contradictory, but people are complicated. So I think one difference between an environmental identity and other types of identity is that an environmental identity is not intrinsically tied to a particular group of people, which makes it slightly more difficult to turn into a political force, although not impossible, as I'll say in a minute. I'll also say, and I think some of your earlier questions got at this, that there is something very fundamental about an environmental identity. And you're probably familiar with the idea of biophilia, the evidence that we have a inherited tendency to kind of like nature and to feel connected to nature. So that makes an environmental identity, I think, potentially very profound and important. On the other hand, certainly people do try to link environmental identity to political identities in some ways. And I'll say in a lot of Western countries, particularly the United States, you know, environmental issues have become very politicized. So people might take a position on an environmental issue that doesn't have anything to do with how they feel about the environment, but does have to do with how they feel about their political groups.
Are there any ways to bypass that problem? Because we're not going anywhere like that. I read the report that I will mention later on, that maybe emphasizing health problems caused by global warming and climate change would be a way to bypass political orientation, and therefore like the complete shutdown of discussion in regards to global warming and climate change. Are there any other ways of doing it?
Well, in general, you want to find ways of talking about things that you know, people will agree with, as opposed to allowing them to link environmental issues to other identities. So everybody agrees on that health is a good thing, and everybody wants to protect their own health and their family's health. So that's a good one. Almost everybody really likes nature. So if you can sort of remind them about nature and the various values that nature has that are not connected to political issues, that can help too. For some people, that might be a religious argument, potentially. There are religious doctrines that talk about how important nature is, the sort of morality of protecting nature. There are a lot of people, speaking of morality, a lot of people do agree that there's a moral component to protecting nature. So that argument can sometimes be highlighted. That's a start.
Yeah. And that's a very interesting hook to the next question that I want to ask, which is, environmental concern is normally perceived as a leftist or cause, or belonging to the political left. But we know that there's a history of right and far right ideologies that use ecology as a way to incite nationalist sentiment. So there's a movement called eco-nationalism. Of course, I'm sure you are aware, of that iconifies native species and landscapes as a way to incite these nationalist sentiments. And then there are other more extreme like movements that actually advocate for the end of democracy in order to instaur a totalitarian regime that would tackle climate change. So you mentioned morality. We can also talk about ethics. But my question is there a connection between the type of environmental identity that we've been talking about and movements such as eco-fascism or eco-nationalism?
Right. Well, first, I'm not a political scientist, so I don't want to imply that I have a great deal of knowledge about political movements. I do think I don't think there's necessarily a connection there, but I think that far right, nationalist, fascist kinds of movements can use our connection to the environment as a tool. So it can be kind of co-opted by them to advance that particular, that particular kind of political ideology. Just like, your desire to protect your family can be co-opted, or purity is, very, what's not to like about purity, but it's very easily co-opted. So I don't think there's a necessary connection, but I think that absolutely it is used in some cases. And I think it's, well, it may just be a lack of complicated thinking, that people focus on a single issue and elevate it above all other issues.
So this might be a silly question, but is there a degree of, like, a range of morality that we can assign to what an environmental identity should be? Or because we have landowners and people that exploit land, can we say that they have, because of their attachment to land and to nature, they also have an environmental identity, but we might condemn what they do with the environment. But so I'm just trying to understand if there's a range of what's acceptable within the environment, the attachment to the environment and the consequences that attachment can bring about, or environmental identities doesn't have a moral aspect to it or ethical aspect per se.
Well, I'm not quite sure if you're asking, is there sort of an absolute moral value? And I think that would be very hard to say. It's like, what is the absolute morality required of a national identity, for example? So I think that to the extent that you have a strong environmental identity, it will affect your moral reasoning. Morality is, complex. There are different things that, there are different demands, or competing demands even, that morality might make on us, and we have to decide which is the right, which is the right behavioral choice. I'm sure you're aware that philosophers have, spent thousands of pages trying to decide what is the moral choice in a particular case. I think that to the extent that you have a strong environmental identity and you're kind of reminded about it, it will affect the way you evaluate the morality of an action, but it might not necessarily lead to a particular outcome, because even people who care about the environment might prioritize, making an income to feed their family first, for example. I will just add that when I first started sort of investigating the idea of environmental identity, it was partly from talking to farmers that made me aware, because they, in some cases, feel a very powerful sense of connection to the land and actually responsibility to care for the land. We might not agree in some cases with the way they care for the land, but they are thinking about it, at least at the small farmer level.
And I think also my question was not very precise there, so it might have made your answer even more difficult. So I apologize for that. But now I wanted to change a little bit of the direction and add climate change to the equation. And we are often confronted with the physical and material consequences that will suffer from climate change, but not so much the psychosocial consequences. So I would like to have your opinion on what are the main psychosocial impacts that climate change will have, particularly in relation to ourself and social identities.
Absolutely. And you said something earlier about how health is an argument that, or a basis for convincing people on a variety of different political perspectives about the importance of attending to environmental issues. And so I think it's all the more important to recognize the health implications of climate change, including the mental health implications. I often divide the potential impacts of climate change on mental health and well-being into three kind of categories. One is the very straightforward traumatic effects of living through a natural disaster or an extreme weather event. So to the extent that climate change leads to an increase in flooding and significant storms and wildfires, those can definitely be traumatic to live through and lead to increases in mental health problems. People, I think, are less aware of the mental health implications of gradual changes in climate, like rising temperatures. But in fact, there's a significant body of research that says that mental health problems are increased as the temperature goes up. Not only people are more likely to be admitted to mental institutions, they're more likely to commit suicide in very hot conditions, but they also just, their moods are worse. There was an interesting study recently that looked at people's posts to social media and found that they were more likely to use negatively toned words when the day was hot. So there's that. And then the third category is, I think, the sort of worry and concern that many people feel associated with kind of knowing that climate change is happening. And that's been getting a lot of press recently. There's not a lot of empirical research yet, but there's some suggesting, yes, that, for a lot of people, it's just a source of stress. And perhaps for some people, it's actually a significant enough source of stress that it's interfering with their mental health, with their social relations, and so on.
I also feel that despite an acknowledgement that climate change is happening, there's a difficulty in the perception of climate change. Maybe we can talk about a post-COVID and pre-COVID era, but let's generalize here and let's assume that there is indeed this difficulty in perceiving and understanding climate change, because it's indeed a process with a vast scale, both in time and space, and it's completely beyond in individual control and unfortunately human control, it seems. But there's also, we're constantly confronted with representations of climate change and not the effects themselves. And I say us, I'm talking about a very specific part of the population. And all this data, all of these analytical processes and facts that we are confronted with don't seem to kind of touch our affect, or the effective part that could potentially allow us to really engage with this issue in a more personal, in a more effective way, or at least understand it better. So I have two questions in one. In relation to environmental identity, how, if we assume that we have a higher identification with an environmental identity, how does that change our perception or facilitates our perception on climate change on the one hand? And on the other hand, how does this identification with an environmental identity act as a mediator for climate change impacts?
Well, so the first question is pretty straightforward, that people who are high in environmental identity, at least in the countries that have been studied, which is a pretty wide range of countries, are more likely to kind of recognize and believe that climate change is happening. And I think this illustrates the way identities work. They kind of direct your attention. So a lot of people may not be paying attention to environmental changes, but if you're high in environmental identity, you do pay attention to those changes. And of course, you care about them. Now, how it might affect your, the way in which you're affected by climate change is a tough one, because I think it is possible that people high in environmental identity, because they're paying more attention, are actually more worried. Well, they are more worried. They are more concerned, and so maybe they're experiencing more negative, negative mood, and perhaps even, well, could potentially be experiencing greater effects to their mental health. But I do want to say that I think environmental identity also has a potential buffering effect. So there's evidence that feeling a sense of connection to nature is a source of personal resilience. So yeah, a little bit of one, a little bit of the other.
And do you think the situation now with COVID-19, and as I said in the introduction, for me, in my lifespan, I've never been confronted with a situation like this that really made tangible that indeed my life and our lives as societies are intimately connected to a broader ecosystem that we cannot see as a background anymore. So it doesn't seem like we have that much of an option anymore. Will that situation and the global, on the one hand, the global scale of the situation, and on the other hand, the personal effect that it had on us as individuals, will it increase or make it easier for people to act in a pro-environmental way? Or if we want to go back to the notion of environmental identity, will it have a positive impact in terms of increasing the environmental identities of the whole world? Mm-hmm. And I'm of course exaggerating there.
Well, I think time will tell. I hope so. And I think a couple of things that we've talked about suggest it might happen. One is just, again, that recognition of interdependence with the natural world, that there's a really sort of profound hubris in Western society where we think that we can be immune from natural forces and we've conquered nature. And this is a reminder that natural forces are still pretty powerful. Also, there's been a lot of kind of media focus on how much people appreciate nature now, that because they can't do a lot of the things they used to do. So they're spending time out in nature. People are engaging in, bird watching, looking out their windows. They're really happy to see those things. So there is that possibility. I do want to, though, say that it's so much depends on the social context. And I think we could recognize how much, that we're all having a shared experience. The entire world is being affected by, these interactions with the natural world. And that could encourage a stronger environmental identity. Or political leaders could emphasize kind of competition, that we want our country to be first and we don't want to be affected by those countries. That the way to survive the coronavirus is to go back to normal as opposed to changing our ways of being. So I think that this is a potential shift. It's a potential sort of fulcrum at which we can change our culture. But a lot depends on what governments do, I think. And we're not entirely dependent on governments, but we are very strongly affected by governments.
I think the COVID-19 situation emphasized the effects of climate change, also in terms of how they are unequally distributed. And I was reading the report by the American Psychological Association on the interface between psychology and climate change, which you are a part of. And I was really struck by, I already knew that some people that different communities and different people would experience the consequences of climate change in different ways. But I never thought of this as having winners and losers, as the reports put it. So I would like to read some of the winners might be regions that may benefit by being able to increase agricultural production, or by having access to oil reserves in previously inaccessible regions such as Siberia. And of course, on the loser side, you have a number of populations such as the people living in risk-prone areas, some communities of color, indigenous communities, older adults, and women and children. And I think you living in the United States are even more aware than all of us of the times that we're living with the Black Lives Matter cause. And we can also think about this, the consequences of global warming and of climate change connected to concepts such as environmental privilege or environmental racism, and so on and so forth. Maybe I will not be able to contextualize these other contexts so well, concepts so well, because we're focusing on environmental identity. But I do know that you have an interest in the psychology of justice. So my question would be, or is, how are environmental challenges presenting both an opportunity and a context to really understand and grasp the perceptions of social inequity and justice?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting example of kind of motivated thinking that most people, most people will say they want to live in a fair society and a just society, but they also want to believe they already do live in a just society. So a lot of people, I think, at least initially, resist the idea that climate change affects different groups differently. And I've definitely seen people kind of react very negatively to that argument. Like, what do you mean? This is an issue that affects all of us. But I do think that when people do recognize the extent to which, the benefits and costs are unequally distributed, that's another motivating force. Like, oh, well, that's bad. That they recognize that that's really unfair. So it might motivate additional action and at least additional concern. And I just want to highlight that, probably the two biggest predictors of vulnerability to climate change effects are geographic. So if you happen to be in a place that's already subject to drought and heat, it's probably going to get drier and hotter. Or if you're in a low-lying area, you might be affected by rising sea levels. But even at least as powerfully, economics. So, wealthy people, wealthy countries will be able to spend money to protect themselves from the impacts of climate change to a large extent, not completely, but to a large extent. And both, entire countries that are mostly poor, but also within wealthy countries, the poorer people are definitely already being affected more strongly.
I was thinking also about there seems to be a generalized blame and guilt that is assigned to all mankind because of the processes of global warming and climate change. And of course, we are all responsible, but we know that there are different degrees of responsibility. So for instance, some societies are maybe more responsible than others, or specific fuel CEOs might be more responsible than a normal average citizen, and other fuel and climate criminals might be. So I wanted to ask your opinion on, do you think that having a more accurate, how can I say this? Having a more accurate, assigning more accurately and proportionately the guilt and blame, maybe not the guilt, but the blame of climate change, would it then change our awareness of the consequences of it? Because if we belong to a society that is indeed more responsible for CO2 emissions, maybe our responsibility for tackling that issue would increase, ideally. So I'm just wondering, how can we be a bit more nuanced and go beyond this generalized guilt that has been placed on all mankind, that I think covers up the responsibility of certain agents within this process?
Yeah, I think that there are two important things going on. One is absolutely there's been, I think, an attempt to emphasize individual behavior that distracts us from the real, the real principal causes, which are not individual actions, but as you say, they're companies and governments. So the emphasis on individual behavior can be a distracting technique. But I think thinking about individual behavior is also empowering because it reminds us that there's something that we can all do. So I would hate to say, no, don't pay any, every now and then I see an essay in popular media saying something like, I don't care if you recycle, or, go ahead and drive your car. And I don't agree with that, because I think there needs to be a consistency between our behavior. So it would just, if I said, oh, I'm only going to focus on trying to change the government and I'm going to behave any way I wanted as an individual, that would feel wrong. I want to, to live my values. And also because, again, we need to feel that there's something we can do. And those individual actions do add up. Individual choices do contribute to carbon emissions. And of course, companies and governments also respond to what they believe to be the beliefs and priorities of individuals. So I would say sort of both, and be aware that that people are trying to divert your attention, but nevertheless, I do believe individual behavior matters.
And talking about individual behavior, we know that pro-environmental behavior is also attached to a specific consumer group, and it has been marketized. I don't even know if that word exists, but it has been turned into a commodity to some extent, and it gives some status to the people that can actually afford to have pro-environmental lifestyles. On the bigger scale, we also know that climate catastrophe for some geoengineering is also a market resource, right? So I wanted to understand to what extent our capacity of having environmental identities is shaped by eco-capitalism or by the fetish of pro-environmental lifestyles.
I think it can certainly affect the form that your environmental identity takes. So absolutely, there's been a huge trend in marketing a so-called green identity, so that you buy the product so you can feel good about yourself, and you buy the product so you can prove to other people, yes, look, I'm a good environmental citizen. I think that probably, for most people, that suggests at core, they do care about the environment, but it also puts emphasis on the social interpretation of that identity rather than on the actual significance of it.
Do you think, for instance, in more consumer-oriented societies, the environmental identity that those could allow for are compromised because of this context, or that the individual capacity to relate to our natural environment is something that is not really affected by that to that much extent?
Well, I guess I don't completely know the answer. My guess is that people will still be able to relate to the natural environment, but it's definitely the case that your environmental identity is affected by the extent to which it has social support. So I think it's easy to think of the environmental identity as totally about the relationship between the individual and their environment, but that relationship is very much created by your social context, it's interpreted by your social context, it's facilitated by your social context. People who are living in a society that does not encourage them to care about the environment or to take action on behalf of the environment are much less likely to do it. It really makes a difference. Even if you've had a fairly strong environmental identity, if you're not getting support for it, you're less likely to act on it.
I just have two more questions, and then we can open up for discussion. So whoever has questions can already start preparing for that. But I wanted to, at least the way when I was reading about environmental identity, and maybe I kind of started building up this romantic idea about it, but for me, it implied a shift in worldview, where humans are not anymore in the center of everything, and you all of a sudden start acknowledging other non-human and non-living entities that have indeed agency on your behavior and on your own identity, right? And we know that for some non-Western and indigenous cultures, this is already the worldview. And of course, I hypersimplify things here, but my question is, do you think that in our Western societies today, to what extent we can just, by valuing and looking at these non-Western indigenous cultures, for instance, to what extent could they provide us with answers, ways of being, ways of understanding ourselves within this shifting world that someone in our culture is not, it doesn't seem to give us the instruments or the worldview to achieve that.
You're absolutely right, that a lot of indigenous cultures do kind of acknowledge this relationship between humans and nature, and treat non-human entities with much more respect as part of their way of life. I think it could potentially, it can be a source of a new perspective for people. Just, for most people, just reading about that probably won't be enough to change their own perspective. But for some people, it could be sort of eye-opening to say, oh, yes, this I never thought of it this way. So we need to shift our perspective to decenter humans from the center, as you were saying in the beginning. And hearing about indigenous cultures that, have entire social and political systems based on that different way of thinking about nature could help people to recognize the kind of legitimacy of that perspective.
And when thinking about the environmental identities, again, maybe in my romanticized conception of it, and thinking about the shift of just the understanding of what self and identity mean in the first place, and again, referring back to these other types of worldviews, do you think that environmental identity as a force, let's say, could potentially disrupt our essentialist notions of gender or race? Because if we look at these indigenous communities, it's not necessarily what we understand as race, or they have different ways of viewing self and other, and so on and so forth. So do you think thinking of environmental identity as a potential force could take us to that situation where we kind of question also those constructs and notions?
I don't know. There's no data on this that I'm aware of. I think potentially, again, by sort of emphasizing egalitarianism and interconnections, it could reduce the emphasis on understanding, different racial groups as being a totally different category of people, or gender as, having this fundamental, essential distinction. So it'd be interesting to know if that's a possibility, but I don't know.
Okay. Well, I have many other questions, but I'll shut up and give the mic to whoever wants to ask some questions in the auditorium. And then we can maybe get some questions online. So for those who are watching on Zoom or YouTube, write your questions, and then my colleague Yasmine will select a couple of them. I'm aware of Dr. Susan's time, and I don't want to push it overboard. So should we start by, if anyone has questions in the auditorium? Okay, we have one question.
Yes, I was wondering how long, because we were talking about guilt, and guilt as a social motor, how long does it last as a motivation for people to change? Just a general thing, like from small scale psychological to a larger movement. There's one question, and the other question is, how is your personal point of view when you look up or think about the future? This is your area and you're working with that, but also, how do you think this pandemic will change our society in general? What do you think? How will this affect? Yeah, that's the two things.
Dr. Clayton?
Yes, so your first question about guilt, I think shows that guilt is a very complicated emotion, and there's some evidence that it does motivate people to change their behavior. But it also can sometimes backfire because nobody likes to feel guilty. So instead of changing their behavior, they deny that your argument has any legitimacy. It's not a very helpful answer, but sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, and probably depends on if you want to make people feel guilty, you definitely need to give them something they can do so they can stop feeling guilty. Then as to thinking about the future and what might happen, well, I try to be optimistic because I feel like that's the only option. If I didn't think positive change was possible, then I would just give up. So I do think, as I said earlier, that, that we are at a potential transition point, and maybe we'll change some things in a lasting way that will be helpful. I think one of the examples is just a huge decrease, of course, in travel and people learning how to do events like this online. I don't think we'll stop traveling, but I think that it could be the case that business travel and sort of events like this, there'll be a lot more of an online presence and fewer people attending in person. So that, is just a huge reduction in carbon emissions right there, just as a specific example. So I do think there's a possibility of positive change due to the coronavirus.
Thank you. I just want to point out that Nina Novak was the one making the question. I forgot to ask that people should introduce themselves before asking the question. But Nina is a participant here at the Jan van Eyck, one of the artists in residency. Anyone else? And now Hisham will ask a question.
I need to bend. Thank you, Bruno and Susan, for your interview, which is great. My question is, how does this all come back to the assessment that you're working on for the IPCC? How does all of your research relating to environmental psychology and environmental identities come back? Thank you.
Dr. Susan?
Yes, good question. So most of what I'm doing for the IPCC is to talk about the impacts of climate change on mental health and well-being. And the focus is on, everyone, the population at large. So it doesn't really talk about how individuals, some people, like environmental identity might affect how you're responding. But environmental identity affects my work in a more subtle way by suggesting that there are the obvious impacts of climate change, and then there are the more subtle ways in which disrupting our normal interactions with the natural world might have effects on well-being. So definitely we're trying to not just focus on mental health that can be clinically defined and diagnosed, but actual effects on personal happiness and social relations as well due to climate change.
Thank you. Anyone else here? Lucas? So we have one more question.
Hi, I'm Lucas Rehm. This might be a bit of a specific question, but it's related to a project I'm working on at the moment. I was wondering, and perhaps the answer is a simple no, if the term, this neologism solastalgia is something you are working with, and if so, if there's some connection you might see in relation to COVID-19.
Thank you. Actually, I was also wanted to ask that same question. So Dr. Susan, please.
Yes, interesting question. So yes, I'm familiar with the idea of solastalgia. For anyone who isn't, it's a term that was developed by an Australian philosopher to describe, I would say, negative emotional response to environmental change. I've been working on a concept which I call climate anxiety, which is you could potentially say is related to solastalgia or even part of solastalgia, but it is a more specific kind of response. So solastalgia, I think, is a very broad term, and it was very important because I think he was the first person to give a name to that sort of sadness associated with a perception of environmental degradation. Hadn't really thought about how it might be affected by COVID. I think that there might be a sadness as people see that their ways of life have been changed and their typical patterns of interacting with the world have been changed. That might be very similar to solastalgia. I'm not sure that I see a connection to experienced environmental change in a specific way, since I don't see that as one of the consequences of COVID-19, but for some people, maybe they are having that experience.
Any other questions?
Thank you, Susan. I'm David Habets. I'm also a participant here. I wanted to ask, you stated very clearly, identities direct our attention. So our environmental identity directs our attention towards aspects of the environment. But does it also work that direct the other way around? Can we change people's identities by redirecting them towards their world, by redirecting their perception?
Yes, please, you can answer that.
Yes. Yeah, really interesting question. I think when we think about identities, they are formed over a long term. So they change, but they change slowly, they develop, but also their kind of salience, how important they are to us at any given time can change fairly quickly. So yes, I think the things that we experience, the environment that we're in can definitely change the aspect of our identity that we're currently conscious of. If, if I was in the middle of a woods, I might be aware of my environmental identity, but if someone came through and started, shouting at me on the basis of my my citizenship or, my gender or my race, then I would be very aware of those identities instead. And I think also in a slower way, the environment can direct the environment, very broadly speaking, can direct our attention away from the natural environment and towards something else in a way that would affect our environmental identity. So absolutely, the identity you feel both responds to outside circumstances and then directs the way we interact with the external circumstances in a cyclical process.
Any other questions? One more question from Aliki.
Hello, I'm Aliki van der Kruis. I'm a participant. I often pick up trash from the street, and there's a particular can that is always on the street to find. And this weekend I was talking with my father about the fact that could you develop also kind of environmental racism? Because now, like, we don't have the Black Lives Matters. Now, like, sorry, I don't know how to say it. It's more that we have to grow into a new connection with each other and with nature. But there will also be a level in connectedness to nature environment. So I don't know if is a question already clear, but
can you mute that microphone so I can unmute Dr. Susan? You're unmuted, Dr. Susan.
Well, I'm not sure I have a good answer. I think when we talk about environmental racism, we are usually talking about a sort of institutional or structural racism that leads, people of minority groups to be more exposed to environmental hazards. But there could definitely be an individual kind of environmental racism that essentially says, I don't care about the experience of this group of people. Because, so if you're sort of already a racist, that might have environmental implications. It sounded like you might be suggesting that you might develop a racist perception of a particular group based on their environmental circumstances. And I think that could be true if a minority group is living in sort of degraded environment, maybe there's a high level of pollution. People might think, oh, they're not even taking care of their environment. And that kind of contributes to a stigmatization of that group, that has failed to take into account the circumstances that, might lead them to live in that way.
Great, thank you. Any other from here? I think we can go online now, and I'll ask my colleague Yasmine to give us some. Leva, could you take the microphone to Yasmine, please? And then later on, if anyone else thinks of another question here in the auditorium, we can pick that up. So please, Yasmine.
Thank you. Yeah, we actually have a lot of interesting questions in the chat. It's hard to choose, both on the Zoom and on the YouTube. I'm gonna make a combination of two because they are related in questions, but also related with us being an art institution. So one is actually an anonymous attendee. What are the social factors that contribute to a strong environmental identity? How can cultural production or arts and media contribute to an awareness of environmental identity? I think this is also connected to a short question by Alexandra Huddleston. Have you come across any works of arts that have transformed your environmental identity?
Dr. Susan, go ahead.
Yes, I'm glad somebody asked this question. So definitely the social factors are very important. One of the things we learn from our social context is to value nature. So a lot of parents, I think, will very deliberately take their children out into the natural world and discuss with them how beautiful it is and how we need to protect it. And I think that's, an important lesson for those children that will help to shape their environmental identity. I think that arts and media can serve a very important function by directing people's attention. And we talked about a perspective shift, and I think that's something that art is very, very good at, getting people to see something differently, just calling their attention to something that maybe they had not noticed before, whether it just be, how beautiful some element of nature is, or how some element of nature is changing, or how the human-built environment is infringing upon nature. So arts, I think, really draw our attention to something, but then also can make us look at it in a totally new way. And I'm not thinking, if I had more time, I would be able to think of a specific example. I'm not thinking of one right now, but I know that there have been a number of art exhibits that have really been designed to make people think, for example, about climate change in a new way. And I think it can be very powerful. And so that's like, to the extent that art exists within the social context, art is the force created by the social context that can help to direct our sort of personal emotional response to the environment and environmental change.
Thank you. I think the next question is kind of related. It's from George. He's saying, as a professor, how do you see the university and the education's role in changing the perspective on the worldview that was mentioned? Is formal education still an interesting tool? And what other educational tools do we have at hand to address environmental issues? Would you include art and artists here?
Dr. Susan, please.
Yes, I absolutely would. So as a professor, I do a lot of teaching, and I think that you can care a lot about the environment and not know anything about it. And so you won't, you might still be behaving very badly because you're just ignorant. So there's just facts that people need, as well as the opportunity to develop an environmental identity. So I obviously teach, young adults. Earlier education for young people is very, very important in helping them to develop that environmental identity by taking them out and giving them opportunities to directly experience nature. And I would say that's true in formal educational settings, but informal education is a really powerful experience for people of all ages. I work a lot in zoos, which consider themselves as places that have an environmental education responsibility, or botanical gardens, or other sort of science museums. Definitely do a lot to try and convey this environmental message. And absolutely, I would include art and artists. I always try. I have no art background or ability myself, but I always try to incorporate that. We have a very small art gallery at my university, and if there's a relevant exhibit, I'll take my class over there to get that perspective on environmental issues, because as I've said before, I think it conveys something that can't be necessarily summarized in words, but encourages a new perspective on these issues.
Thank you. Can we have maybe one more?
Yeah, there's lots more interesting ones coming in, so it's hard to choose. But I have a nice one here from Mina on the Zoom, asking, could you elaborate further on the link between religion and spirituality and environmental identity, especially concerning the fact that most religions inherit the notion of being entangled in a broader system that transcends individuality? To make it more concrete, are there studies on whether religious communities care more about nature in their everyday lives, maybe moderated by morality? And she says, thank you for the webinar.
Dr. Susan?
Yes, good question. There are such studies, and mostly they find that, at least in Western societies, people who are more religious are less likely to care for the environment. And I would say that's not because religion itself is anti-environment, but that we need to recognize the social construction of religion. And certainly in the United States, people who are very religious tend to be also more conservative. And that's the thing that matters more there. And similarly, people have thought maybe collectivist cultures will be more pro-environmental, but they're not, even though they should sort of recognize those links and that greater good. So I think for some people there can be such a connection, and definitely a lot of people talk about their experiences in nature as spiritual to them, as a source of religious meaning. And there are people, E.O. Wilson being one of them, who have tried to convey that that message using religious language. A number of other people, some of whom I've worked with also as well. So I think that religious beliefs can be a channel to kind of encourage value for nature, and also maybe personal obligation to care for nature. But it all depends on how that religious message is kind of conveyed by the specific social group that is articulating it.
Dr. Susan, would it be okay to ask you to answer one more question from the Zoom chat? Okay, so pushing it. One more.
Yay. There's actually two questions relating to the notion of the Anthropocene. So I will make one, but it seems there's an interest in that. So this is from Sue, asking, I would be interested to hear how she, as a psychologist, relates to the concept of the Anthropocene Humans are affecting all parts of the world. How does the concept of humans affecting the planet change our identity towards the planet? Thank you.
Dr. Susan?
Yes, I think one thing it does is it kind of forces that sense of responsibility that we were talking earlier about, people perhaps not wanting to admit that they have responsibility. But I think it's a very accurate concept. And one thing it does, I don't think this has yet become widely recognized, but I think it starts to tear down that distinction that many of us make between human and nature. That if you ask people what is nature, they typically talk about things that have not been affected by human beings. And as Bill McKibben said, there is nothing like that anymore. Humans have affected everything, and humans are part of nature. And we need to, when we think about protecting the environment, stop thinking about it as something that we're protecting that's not us and that's far away from us, and that we protect it by staying away from it. And instead, think about ways in which we can coexist with other aspects of the natural environment.
Okay, I think we have to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Dr. Susan, for the generosity and the time to be here. And I want also to thank the team at the Invenec that worked effortlessly to make this happen in the best way possible. Thank you very much. The participants that are here and those of you who are online that also sent questions, appreciate it very much. And also for everyone who watched online. And join us next time. The next conversation will happen on the 15th of July. I think that we had our share of information for today, so I will not push it more to you. So please pay attention to our upcoming program. And again, thank you, Dr. Susan. It was a pleasure to talk to you.